Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Acadia Inlet. This painting was accomplished on an 8 by 10 inch sheet of 140 pound cold press Watercolor watercolor paper. The photograph on the right was my reference and inspiration for this painting. When I did my sketch, I made a few minor adjustments to the composition. This photo was taken at low tide, and I decided to bring the water in a little closer to the rocks and trees when I did this. Also, the point that sticks out from the tree line and goes into the water and actually divides the body of water, I opted not to go as far so as not to divide the water, but I still have a point, but it doesn't reach out to the complete other side of the composition. You also see in the bottom right corner of the photograph there's a piece of land that's coming in because it's low tide. I opted not to include that and leave that water. This is a sketch I did with a B pencil. There's not a lot of detail. For the most part, what I've done is drawn the major shapes, such as the tree line shapes, the sky, the water, and indicated where the landmass, the rocks, and the trees are at. Before I begin putting down some larger washes, there's a few areas where I'm going to preserve a little bit of the white. There's a highlight that hits that landmass, and I've had some bird shapes in here that I'm going to mask off. Also a few rocks in the water, and there's a kind of a fallen tree that's a light shape in my photograph, and I'm going to stick with that. So I have a fine line masking fluid pen, and I'm just given just a slight indication of a few of these areas where there's a very bright highlight. I know one of the problems sometimes using these fine line masking fluid pens is that they clog easily. One of the things you can do, and I've seen some recent posts on Facebook where some people have suggested, is if you store them upside down, the air can't get to the tip area. It stays full of fluid and it won't dry out. And so that's a good suggestion that a few people have made on Facebook. But I like to use these when I have a very small detailed area that I want to mask. Now that my masking fluid is completely dry, I'm going to begin by putting in a sky wash. And I'm using a jumbo round small silver black velvet wash brush, and I'm applying a mixture of cerulean blue and manganese blue. You'll notice as I'm applying this wash that I'm applying it in a manner to give a suggestion of a direction, which is a little different than the clouds in the photograph. If you look, you can see kind of two wisps of cloud that are kind of pointing from the top left more towards the downward to the right, and I'm trying to create more of a motion where it's drawing the eye more in towards the trees, so I've shifted that a little bit. I actually drew some light pencil marks to indicate that direction in my initial sketch, which are hard to see, and I'm softening the edges with a fine mist spray bottle I like to use, and I'll use a tissue to get the excess at the bottom so that it doesn't start backwashing on me. Now I'm going to continue down into the water using the same mixture of cerulean blue and manganese blue. So this is going to be the base color for the water, and to give the suggestion of picking up the color of the sky. And later on in the painting I'll start to introduce some colors that are more reflections of the tree shapes and the land masses. So this blue is going to be my base, and as I introduce some of the other washes, they'll go over top of this blue. As I put this wash down and make my brush strokes, some of them I put down with an intent to give full coverage of an area, and other ones I make a very rapid stroke with my brush and with the intent to leave some texture. Now here I'm brushing rather quickly, but I've got a fully saturated brush, so I'm not going to leave any texture, and that's not what I want. But if you look a little bit above that, where I made some quick brush strokes, you can see a little bit of texture right there, because of the speed at which I made the brush stroke, and it was actually a light touch too, so it kind of scraped along the surface. You'll see often I take a tissue to lighten areas or soften edges. Next, I'm going to begin working on these distant tree lines, and I've tried to section those off, make that a little bit more distinct there, to suggest 3 distances on these tree lines. So the one I'm painting right now, I'm using a bit of cobalt violet with a little cerulean blue in it, also kind of a gradation from the violet to the cerulean blue. But I'm using that tone to suggest the farthest mass of land and grouping of trees. And I'm also going to introduce just a touch of some green down there to provide a little bit more interest to that shape. And I'm softening it with a tissue because this is a distant land mass, and it's not going to have as sharp an edge as some of the tree shapes that are closer. And you can see a little bit of just a touch of green in there with the purple and with the blue. Now I'm going to move closer and do the second tree line that I've indicated here. And for this one, I'm using a mixture of sap green with pyro red. And at some points, I'll introduce a little raw sienna, and I'll also introduce at times some royal blue to darken the mixture. And I'm going to put a little cobalt violet in there just to keep the harmony of the color going throughout my composition. So you can see it's a little bit darker value and a little harder edge than the first tree line that I indicated. Now I'm going to start on the third tree line, which is the closest of the tree lines on the right. And I'm going to give an indication of there's a line of a green tone that runs parallel to the shore. So I'm using a mixture of sap green, pyro red, and a touch of raw sienna in the mixture. And starting out by giving the indication of that kind of a light, bright green that runs parallel to the shore. Now I'm going to take some of that same tone, and so far everything has been horizontal. Now I'm going to start to give it some verticality and take that color up and start to give the indication of the highlighted areas of some of the tree shapes. I'm using the same color mixture right now, and I'm applying the paint using a quill brush that I like to use. As I've mentioned in some of my videos, it's an inexpensive brush. It holds a nice point and holds quite a bit of pigment. And it's not easy to find, though. One of the things I know I still get questions about the materials I use and the equipment. And I do list all my materials and equipment that I use on the studio page of my website. And I've put that link in descriptions, and I mentioned at the end of my video. But if you go to the studio page on my website, you can see the materials I use, from paintbrushes to paper to paint to masking fluid to the fine mist spray bottle. And I've tried to provide links to the sources that I use, and that's all on the studio page, again, of my website, rsorwitzart.com. As I complete this tree line, you can see that I've painted this as one shape. I didn't try and paint individual trees. I've tried to paint all 3 tree lines as one shape. And now I'm taking some of that darker tone and give the indication of the shoreline there. Just making some horizontal marks. And I'm breaking the line up, and I don't want it just to be a straight line that goes all the way across, so I have some interruption and some variation in the length of those marks also. And keep in mind that right where I'm doing some brush marks is an area where I did put some small amount of masking fluid to preserve some of the whitest whites. And that the mixture that I'm using to give that sienna tone is actually burnt sienna, and in a few areas I've charged a little bit with some quinacridone gold and quinacridone coral, but for the most part it's burnt sienna. Now I'm going to take a plastic scraper here and go ahead and try and scrape a few marks into the tree line. I'm getting some movement of pigment, but not a lot. This has actually gone a little bit past the point where I can do much scraping. So I've got a few marks there, especially on the right side, but towards the left there, that paper's gotten a little dry, so it's really beyond a point where I can move much pigment, which is fine. I just wanted to make a few marks in there to give the suggestion of some tree trunks, and I've got a few of those. I'm switching to a 1/2 inch flat brush. This is again a silver black velvet brush, and I'm trying to make some tree trunk marks, give the indication of some tree trunks, but it's a little too fat a line for me. So I've taken a rigger, and I'm making some of these vertical marks to give the indication of some trees, and with some limbs coming off of it. I've gone back to my 1/2 inch flat brush, and I'm loading it up with a mixture of sap green, pyro red, and a little royal blue, a little raw sienna at times, similar to the mixture that I used on the other tree line shapes. And I'm making some kind of lateral brush marks here to give the suggestion of the pine trees here on this Acadia coastline. And I'm going to take the fine mist spray bottle here, and I'm going to soften some of the brush marks that I put here. I'm going to soften those edges a little bit with a fine mist spray. So not a lot, just enough to get some of the paint moving around a little bit and gradating. And now I'm going to put a few brush marks into the what's now wet paper. And you'll see as I kind of rock my paintbrush here, I'll use the corner and the edge, and I'm getting, because of the spray that I had put down, I'm getting that water, that mixture I'm putting down to run a little bit here in areas. It gives me a soft edge. I'm going to insert this photograph one more time, and you can see that I'm working on the closest cluster of trees here, this tree line that's in the foreground, and I'm working with a darker value than I did in the tree lines on the right. A lot of times when working on a landscape, your values kind of end up tiered in terms of foreground, middle ground, background, and in this case my darkest values are in this foreground area where this cluster of trees are. The edges are a little harder, the contrast a little greater, and as I go back in distance, the value's a little lighter, the edges are a little softer, and the farthest tree line is a cooler purplish tone So a lot of that, again, in a landscape, a lot of times your values can end up tiered like that. I'm using this mixture with the sap green and the pyro red. However, I've introduced more royal blue into it to darken the mixture. And it's going to get quite dark as I bring this wash in down behind these rock shapes. It's a pretty dark tone that I'm using. It's got, as I said, a lot more royal blue in it, which I use often to darken some of my colors. And I'm treating this as a big shape. There's many trees here, but I'm making it as my washes just merge one into the other. Even as I vary color, here I'm introducing some raw sienna into this wash, but I'm painting it as if it's one large shape. Now I'm going to start breaking some of these brush marks up a little bit and give more of the suggestion of shapes that relate to the rocky shoreline here. So I'm going to use various edges of my paintbrush and start to use the darks here to break up this light shape that is the shoreline here, and these would be the kind of the deep shadowed areas that appear around the rocks and on the shoreline. So you can see that as I'm making these marks, I'm taking this 1/2-inch flat brush and just giving the indication of some of these deep pockets of a dark value. But I'm not taking a little round brush and trying to paint these things. I'm just making a mark with the flat brush, and then I move on to another area. And sometimes I drag the edge, the very leading edge of my brush in a straight line. Other times I'll make a mark with the corner of the brush. Sometimes I'll make a brush mark with the side. So it gives some nice variation. Now I want to try and scrape some shapes in here. And one of the things I can tell is there's some areas in this shape where I can successfully move some pigment and make some marks as I just did. And there's some other areas where it's actually too wet right now to make a mark because it fills right back in. And actually what it'll do is it'll leave kind of a dark mark. And you can see there it started to allow me to move some pigment, and then it filled back in because that area right there is really too wet to be trying to scrape into. So when the paper is kind of saturated, it's very shiny. That's not a good time to try and scrape because you're not going to have much success. When the paper is still damp and has a sheen, that's the best time to try and scrape into the paint. And when it's kind of dull and it's beyond this kind of the sheen, you're not going to have much success moving the pigment. So it can happen quickly from one stage to the next. So you have to kind of get a good feel for what you're looking at if you plan on scraping, and don't let it go too far so that it's dry. But you also have to have patience and wait for it to move from being saturated to just kind of being damp and having a sheen to it. I like to not only give the indication of tree trunks in my landscapes with a scraper, but I also like to scrape some kind of rock shapes in and give suggestion of a direction of the ground and the rocks that boulders that might be forming that up. Now I'm taking my 1/2-inch flat brush and I'm taking the same mixture that I've been using in the tree lines, and I'm painting over top of the blue wash that I put down in the water. And I'm using this color to give the suggestion of reflection. So the water's picking up the colors in the trees. I'm going to insert the photo, and you can see kind of on the middle right of the photograph there how that green tone is being picked up in the water. So I have this kind of middle to middle dark value tone that I'm putting down. And while it's wet, I'm going to do some wet and wet brush work. So I'm going to take a darker value. So it's this mixture with some royal blue added to it to make it a darker value. And I'm going to touch it within these brush marks that I've made to give, again, the suggestion of reflection of the trees. So because I'm painting wet into wet, those brush marks are diffusing and creating soft edges. The intent here is to give the suggestion of these tree shapes being picked up in reflection in the water, as well as the green tone of the tree line. There's a slight indication of the reflection of that green tone right here in this little pocket of water. So I'm going to use that same mixture, and I'm going to soften it up a bit more here though. So I'm going to make a few brush marks, and I'm going to spray it softly with a fine mist spray. So I've made my marks, and now I'm going to take the spray and just lightly hit it with that spray to soften it up. Next, I'm going to take some royal blue that's been diluted quite a bit with water, and I'm going to make some cooler marks here in the water to give the suggestion again of reflection, but it's more of a blue tone than it is a green tone. And I'm going to also hit this with a spray bottle to soften this area up a little bit. So I'll take the spray and I'll just lightly hit it. You can see I actually waited just a hair too long because some of those edges started to set on those brush marks, but it'll still be fine because I have more darker values that I want to put over top of that. And now I'm because I've sprayed the paper, it's wet, so the brush work I'm doing now is wet on wet, and it creates soft edges. I want to create still some stronger value marks in within those green shapes, so I'm using a dark mixture with royal blue in it to give a stronger value into those areas. I'm going to carry that tone over into some of the areas where I put the initial blue wash down, just to give the indication of some ripples in the water. And I'm putting some touches of value along the shoreline. And I'm going to bring a little bit of that darker blue into this more foreground area of the water here, where I have these kind of cool reflections going on. I'm going to use a middle value to start to give some shape to these rocks, and I'm using the cobalt violet with a little bit of royal blue, just a touch of royal blue in it, to pick up some of that cobalt violet that I used at the start of the painting when I started to first indicate some of the tree lines. I want to carry that color throughout my composition, so I have kind of some balanced harmony with the colors. I don't want to have it isolated. Now I'm using some raw sienna with some burnt sienna, and giving just the indication of that ground along the shoreline. I don't want to do a whole lot of detail here because I don't want to draw the eye there too much, but just give the indication of the ground color. And it's primarily burnt sienna, but there's some raw sienna in there also. And I'm just working that in and around the areas that I made the marks with the cobalt violet. But I'm going to carry that out to the point there that's sticking out into the water. I'm mixing some ultramarine blue into my burnt sienna to neutralize that and give me a bit of a gray tone, and give some kind of shadowed feeling to some of the ground that I have here. Just making some marks. It's kind of a textured, rough shoreline there. A lot of small rocks, and it's an area that's been exposed by low tide. But I'm not trying to overcomplicate it and paint a lot of detail with it. I'm just giving the suggestion of some value and some warm and cool changes going on there. My paint is a consistency where I can do some scraping, so I'm going to take my plastic scraper and just make some marks that give this more suggestion of some of the rocky surface and some of the boulders, and but just to create some general interest in the shapes and break them up a little bit. I'm going to take the rubber cement pickup eraser. I'm going to remove the small amount of masking fluid that I put in a few areas to preserve the highlights. Now I'm going to take a small angled nylon brush that's damp, and I'm going to do a little bit of lifting, not a lot, just some more interest to this kind of shape that's a mass of trees, but it creates just some movement and some overlap, and just break some of these areas up. So I'm just using, again, clear water on a damp brush. I'll do a little bit here towards on the right side and a little farther back. So not much, just a little bit here and there. I'm going to take my small rigger brush that's loaded with a dark value, royal blue with some pyro red and some sap green in it, and just put some tree shapes in here that have a little bit more detail to them, a little more refined than some of the overall large shapes. So it's a dark value, and I'm also going to take that value and make some marks just to strengthen the suggestion of some of the tree trunks. When making marks like this to suggest a tree trunk, I don't do one continuous line. You can see I skip and I break it up to provide interest to it. You don't want to just have a bunch of sticks that are straight line sticks there. So I often lift my brush and continue it so I have a broken edge. I'm going to give the indication out here in this area, and I'm creating some marks here to give suggestion of these kind of, they call them old nags, which are these kind of dried trees that have been there a while and they have a few branches left on them. They help provide a little bit of interest. So these marks have been made with a very dark value, and I also want to come in and make a few of these linear marks using more of a sienna tone. That will help give some balance to the colors and bring some harmony to my composition. You don't want to isolate colors normally. You want to try and work them in through your composition. So as I'm doing here, and it's hard to pick up on this green, but the tone that I'm putting down now has a bit of a rust color to it. It's a sienna tone, and it helps pick up some of the colors that I've used in the shoreline. So again, just a few of these kind of old dried tree shapes that I'm putting in here. And it's to provide interest, and it's also an opportunity, as I said, to bring in some different colors. I used masking fluid on the left to protect that shape of that kind of fallen tree, dried tree. And as I make some of these marks, I'm going to put that burnt sienna on my brush, and it's a good opportunity to show some of that burnt sienna color up in those trees, because I've saved the white of the paper, so I'm getting a nice reflection of light through that color. I'm also taking some of that cobalt violet and putting some of that on that white. So again, it helps move that color through the composition. I'm taking a little of that cobalt violet and touching it in a few spots here also, just to help reinforce the harmony of the color throughout my composition. I'm going to take some of that dark value, and I have a couple rock shapes here in the water, and I'm using that dark value to show some the kind of the shadow, the underside of the reflection of that rock. And then on the top, I'm again taking some of that burnt sienna and touching the top of those rocks to help carry that color out there. I have my rigger brush loaded up with a dark value of royal blue with a sap green and pyro red, and but very heavy with the royal blue to make it a dark value. And I'm just giving the indication of some dark pockets, some small pockets of very dark value throughout the composition. And I'm using it here to try and show the direction of where the rocks are laying when I make those marks. But these are just arbitrary marks that I'm making where I feel I could use a touch of value to provide interest, to provide depth, and it helps balance with value for the composition. I have a few marks there that just look like polka dots, so I want to make those shapes a little more interesting. I'm going to make some darker marks up here in the trees just to reinforce the brushwork that I've already done there, and here help again enhance the verticality of those shapes. So just a little bit of dark value, not complete solid long straight lines, but just broken up lines of darker value. I'm going to take a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna to give me a little bit of a gray here to give the indication of the shadowed area of this gull that's in the sky. And I have these three gull shapes, but they're not as effective as I'd like them to be. And there's one also up in the kind of the trees there, but I'm not going to fuss with them too much. I'm going to take my damp nylon brush here and lift out a little bit of pigment just to give the indication of the reflection of the light tone of the gull. So just a little lifting. I'm going to put a white mat around my painting. And there you have Acadia Inlet. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, be sure to check out Rick Sorowitz Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook. And if you ever have questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page on rsorowitzart.com. And if you have specific questions, you can email me at contactrsorowitz@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.